It was a largely silent night in Australia's Blue Gum Forest, which was north of Sydney. For the most part, the night was still, with a very faint breeze of wind lightly gushing the treetops about 20 metres above the ground. A ranger named Danielle, or Dan for short, was walking from his car, which he had left a few minutes prior. Headlights were still on. He needed them for a pretty brief period to check the surroundings, making sure he was in the correct area where he was signed. "I love animals, but I hate this job," he whispered silently. He, for a brief period, looked around, guided by his Jeep's lights. They reflected off the many gum trees, separated by a sea of short grasses. "Seems like the correct region," he spoke again, this time aloud. Dan strolled forward. The car lights should turn off eventually, though because it's dark, it probably wouldn't have happened. After all, he doesn't want to get lost. Dan reached for his right pocket, grabbing his flashlight. The cold, rigid surface was distinct, allowing him to identify the surface as the exterior of a flashlight. He pulled the light from his pocket and pressed on the back, turning the light on. "Let's make sure this wildlife is safe," he whispered. Australia's blue gum forests were home to kangaroos, sugar gliders, possums, and various unique bird species. It's just a part of Australia's incredible biodiversity. As Dan traversed deeper into the forest, the trees became taller. After only about 2 minutes of walking, the trees were already double the height of the ones from earlier outside his car. Along with the taller trees, the ferns became denser. He could not see any green grass on the ground, even with his flashlight. Because of how quiet the night was, the only sound he could hear was the sound of leaves and twigs snapping and crunching under his own feet. Dan sniffed the air and scratched his nose. While he was itching, however, he smelt something off. It was pretty similar to a dead kangaroo. Disease? Injury? Dan couldn't be bothered checking, even though it was his job. The only reason he would ever have to check a dead animal is if he heard gunfire, implying there were poachers in the area, and he would have heard gunfire long before the animal was dead. Dan kept on moving as the smell intensified. He began to feel kind of uneasy due to the forest's deafening silence. He'd never experienced a silent forest ever. Before he could contemplate any more, he began hearing strange bellowing sounds in the distance, similar to a cassowary, but it couldn't have been a cassowary because they only live in Queensland, not New South Wales. Dan turned around and slowly began walking back to his car. The creature that was possibly stalking him must have been unidentified. No known predator in the Blue Gum Forest is this big, with a sound this strange. Dan then freaked out as the sound transitioned into a hissing noise. Dan began to run in the other direction. He used his torch to guide his movements. Unfortunately, as he could start beginning to see the car lights split up by the trees, his torch began to flicker. "Jesus, God damn it!" he shouted loudly. He looked around and heard the same rattling noise rapidly approaching. He smacked the flashlight. He then put the glassy bit to his mouth. He blew on the flashlight, and the dust on top of the glass went everywhere. Thankfully, however, it did turn the light on. However, the thankfully part went away very quickly, as Dan regret turning the light back on. He pointed it in a few directions, trying to find where the rattling noise was coming from. His car was only about 50 metres away, so he could potentially make a run for it if anything chased him from the bushes. He then looked down as he felt a strange, sloppy, watery sensation on his foot. He pointed down, and then he jumped back in fear a solid metre away. He saw a corpse of potentially a dead kangaroo. "What the?" he spoke. His voice and movements and mannerisms were taken over by only fear and nothing else. The head and shoulders of the poor marsupial were separate, and the flanks had strange, massive slashes, like something had clawed them. Before Dan could make a run for the car, he was suddenly caught off guard by a massive hissing sound. He felt a sudden but searing pain push him onto the ground by a massive force. He heard his spine snap like a twig from earlier. He felt every single last muscle in his back rip and tear, causing internal bleeding. Before he could yell in pain, felt his nerves get shut down as he heard something begin to rip into his back. He then felt a scaly palm lightly place itself over his neck, with a very sharp, dagger-like object positioned on his head. Before he could react, everything went black. The last thing he could hear was the guttural sound made by the creature. Although he never got to see the creature, he did know a few things about it. It was a predator, and it was massive, at least the length of a crocodile.